Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I want to also thank Michael for that wonderful presentation. My name is Hannah. I am a cis female, um, also a long COVID patient, also an Chinese Canadian. I am sitting at home in my home office in Ottawa, Canada. And today I want to talk a little bit about contextualizing long COVID in relation to what we found in our data, patient-led research collaborative, and also what this means for the future of long COVID advocacy and also advocacy in general in disability justice. Next slide, please. So the patient-led research collaborative consists of patients who are still sick, long COVID patients, and we were formed in April 2020 in the Body Politics Support Group. We are about 45 people across 3 continents, and we have an interdisciplinary background. We have an IRB from the University College London, and we use that to come up with our own research questions and design our own studies. Next slide, please. At PLRC, we do research a little differently than your standard research process. We involve patients at every step of the process. So patient researchers set research agendas based on what we observe in the community and what we see are priorities that directly serve patients. And from there, we engage in community and ask people to raise questions based on their lived experiences. So one example is vaccine effects in long COVID patients. Then patient researchers and collaborators, we also have external collaborators, conduct analysis, and we publish reports that directly share it back to the community. Next slide, please. We're also involved in both collaborations with academic institutions as well as policymakers. I won't go through the whole list because it's quite exhaustive, but to summarize, we have over 150 citations, including by the WHO, the CDC, and various governments. Next slide, please. I'll take a moment to talk a little more about our most well-received paper. And this is the paper that was published in The Lancet last July. We have over 3,700 patients from 56 countries participating in this study. And we have translated the study into 9 different languages. So it was a massive international community effort. Next slide, please. Some of our key results from this study, which will tie directly into what Michael has talked about, and also what we feel are important for the HIV community, as well as the long COVID community to know, are issues that have to do with testing and also symptoms. So what we found is that when we included everyone who had long COVID symptoms, both who had PCR test results come out negative and positive, we found that not only they have comparable symptom time courses, so similar symptoms over time, but the PCR positive cohort was tested early, on average day 6, while the PCR negative cohort was only able to get tested on average day 43. Now, this alone suggests that many of us simply did not have access to testing. As a result, as you might know, many of us are denied care and disability benefits. And this goes against the narrative that long COVID patients are somehow hypochondriacs. Next slide, please. Looking at all the different symptoms, we organized them into 10 categories. And we often hear most about the pulmonary and cardiovascular symptoms, but some of the less talked about categories include musculoskeletal and reproductive. Next slide, please. We also found 9 categories of neuropsychological symptoms. Again, we hear quite a bit about the loss of taste and smell. And in fact, taste and smell are one of the symptoms when you get triaged for testing. So again, this is creating medical bias. The long COVID patients also suffer from vertigo and memory loss and several others at the onset of COVID. Next slide, please. For long COVID folks who are menstruating, we found that 26% have abnormal periods. Myself and a few other of our PLRC teammates included. And this we have not seen too many studies on. Next slide, please. In our long COVID cohort, we looked at the patterns of recovery, and we sorted these symptoms into 3 clusters. The first cluster looks like an L plotted over time. They are acute symptoms, which we are mostly familiar with, such as sore throat. The second cluster looks like a hill with a long decline on the right. These are symptoms that peak 6 weeks after initial COVID infection. The third and final cluster are what we are the most concerned about as long COVID patients. This one looks like a steep ramp up that plateaus over time. And these are symptoms that are not prevalent during the acute phase, but they stay persistent months after infection. These include tinnitus, joint pain, etc. Next slide, please. We know that these symptoms also come and goes. And not only do they have an impact on the patient's quality of life, but also the ability to make a living. We found that 45% of our research participants required reduced work, and 22% said they were not able to work at all after long COVID. So the rest of the paper can be read online in the link within the slides, and I won't cover them in the interest of time. Next slide, please. But what I want to go over are some of the existing biases in long COVID research.
Just one thing.
Yes.
It seems that something is rubbing against your mic and it's making a noise that it's making hard for people to hear you.
Oh, 1 second.
Yeah, just watch out with your mic. Thank you.
Is this better now?
I think so.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I want to go over how this data shapes the long COVID narrative and how might patients and caregivers be more engaged, as well as the wider disability community. How can we advocate better for long COVID patients and also the wider disability community? Next slide, please. One of the things that we would like folks to recognize, and I mentioned this before, is the testing bias. We need to include not only those who have access to testing, but also probable and suspected cases of infection. So we suggest to use the WHO's definition for probable and suspected cases in cohorts, and this is both for care providers and also for research. We see that only 25% of cases are confirmed to this day, and only 1 to 3% of cases from the first wave, which includes folks who got sick in March and April 2020, were confirmed. And these were predominantly hospitalized patients. And that was a time when we had very little testing. So currently we are missing quite a lot of patients who haven't gotten testing. Next slide, please. So why does discarding those without lab confirmed test result hurt patients other than we're not including that data? What we've seen is that those without lab confirmed testing experience an additional 8 weeks in delay in care. And this is because, when you don't have proof that you have COVID or long COVID, you are denied further care. These people are less likely to have adequate rest or time off. They're more likely to have a loss of income and are more likely to be unable to live alone at 6 weeks. Next slide, please. Won't go over this in too much detail, but antibody testing is also an area that is a bit fuzzy. We see in studies that 36% of patients don't make antibodies, and this has to do with also gender differences. Males are 4 times more likely to retain antibodies, and 36% of female patients lose antibodies between the months of 3 and 6. So this is very relevant to those who have long COVID for that amount of time or more. Next slide, please. Overall, we see that several studies show that long COVID can be predicted by a weak or lacking antibody response. And I know Michael also mentioned this in the HIV cohort. Next slide, please. It's pretty important for us to communicate this to counter current narratives that long COVID patients are mostly hospitalized or have severe cases of initial acute COVID. Even if long COVID happens after 50 to 70% of severe cases and 15 to 30%, and this is verified by various studies, of mild cases, there are significantly more mild cases. So most cases of long COVID actually happened after mild acute illness. Next slide, please. This is something for everyone to keep in mind. We have just a new medical code came out for long COVID, but very few people have been using it. So if you or someone you love, have common diagnoses that are related to long COVID, pay attention. And some of these common diagnoses are dysautonomia, including POTS, ME/CFS, mast cell activation syndrome, small fiber neuropathy, connective tissue disorders, reactivations of other viruses. So it might not show up as long COVID in your medical records, but if you experience these symptoms and you had acute COVID, it might be long COVID. So in conclusion, next slide, please. We want to address some of the issues with long COVID research going forward. And as Michael said, we spent much of 2020 advocating that long COVID exists. And now that we've gotten to the point where people recognize that long COVID is an issue, we want to have more robust studies and more robust treatments that are effective for the people who actually have long COVID. So we need a more comprehensive selection of patients in studies and also in treatment. Most long COVID patients were not hospitalized. Many didn't experience respiratory symptoms onset. Many were not PCR positive or antibody positive. Many had mild acute cases, and many never had low oxygen levels. We also need studies to include issues like post-exertional malaise. So not just look at symptoms at any one given time, but over time. Many studies are missing neurological, especially cognitive issues. And we need studies and treatment options built on post-viral research. Next slide, please. So this concludes my talk. Thank you so much, and thank you, JD, and the rest of the team for having me here. If there are any questions you have regarding our work, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Michael. We invite people to type your questions in the Q&A in the chat. We're going to take a little break so the panelists can look at any questions and people can take care of what you'd like to do for 5 minutes. So we're going to come back at 35 minutes after the hour to start back up with a very brief Q&A and then on to our next panel. Thank you so much.